Nama Om Vishnupadaya Krishna Prasnaya Bhutale Srimati Bhakti Vedanta Swaminiti Namane Namaste Saraswati Deve Gauravani Prachane Nirvishesha Shunyavadi Pastya Chadeshatane Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadha Shivasari Gaura Bhaktivinoda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare Vanchakapacharubhyascha Kripa Sindhubhya Evacha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha. Srila Prabhupada Ki, Anantakoti Vaishnava Vrinda Ki. Haribol. Okay, so let's just have a look at this whole section, third section of Bhagavad Gita. We're already halfway through it, at least in terms of the numbers of chapters, the number of chapters. Of course, the last chapter is a long chapter, so there's more to go through in one sense in 16, 17, and 18. Yeah, but there's a whole system. It's a very systematic presentation through these last 6 chapters. Yeah. Examining, like we said, we told you earlier, the last 6 chapters are focusing, Lord Krishna is focusing on a type of jnana, knowledge, which is helpful to bhakti, helpful to Krishna consciousness. It's not just some knowledge for the sake of it, but it's very closely connected with devotional service and very helpful and even very important for our progress in Krishna consciousness. To understand these things, particularly, how is the material nature working? That's the essence of it. How is the material nature working? And how does one have to practice Krishna consciousness in order to deal with the material nature without becoming overwhelmed by it and just dragged down to the material level, and then sure, anything could happen. Back into the ocean of birth and death. Yes, so how to relate with the material nature in terms, particularly as we heard last night, but the other nights also, particularly in terms of the relationship between Lord Krishna and ourselves, and then the relationship between the material nature and Lord Krishna, and then our relationship with the material nature in the context of our and material nature's relationship with Krishna. Right, so 13th chapter, of course, there was the discussion, nature, the enjoyer, and consciousness, the Purusha, the spirit soul, us, entangled in Prakriti, with some just introductory ideas about how we can train our consciousness to not be overwhelmed by Prakriti or material nature. Then 14th chapter, of course, that was all about the modes. We're going to be hearing quite a bit more about the modes, actually, as time goes on. How they're working, the characteristics of people who are in the different modes. But in the 14th chapter, it was more like an introduction to the modes. I mean, quite a comprehensive introduction, but still more or less an introduction. Then in the 15th chapter, which we just completed yesterday, the material nature was described in terms of the example of the reflected banyan tree. and how people become entangled in material nature in that context, in the context of the material nature being like a reflected banyan tree, and the spiritual nature, of course, being the actual real banyan tree. So, but then, that was just the first few verses. Then from verse 6 to verse 20, it was all about Purushottam Yoga, pure devotional service, as the complete solution in all these senses here, for the Purusha, for the soul in relation to Prakriti, for us in relation to the modes of material nature, and in relation to the example of the reflected banyan tree. So now, this chapter 16, the divine and demoniac natures, it's going to show us, well, it is something about the divine nature, the Krishna conscious nature, the qualities of a Krishna conscious person, to encourage us to cultivate those qualities, of course. But then the majority of the 16th chapter is focusing, showing what happens if you really get entangled in Maya. What happens to you if you really get into Maya? Maya, of course, means illusion. So if you get into just heavy illusion, what happens to you? Well, you become a demon. And well, we'll go through all of that more tomorrow, I think. At least we'll start on it tomorrow. The nature, the characteristics of the demons, and oh gosh, it's just a disaster. It's just too horrible. Just too drastically horrible. Yeah, so Lord Krishna very graphically describes the defects of becoming a demon. And, you know, it's not just a description, but it's a warning to us, because that's where we've come from, let's face it. That's where we've come from. But we've been saved. Oh, Krishna, by the mercy particularly of Srila Prabhupada, and then the mercy of his sincere followers, we have been saved and given this just inconceivably wonderful opportunity for becoming Krishna conscious and going back to Godhead. So it is a warning, because we know that sometimes devotees leave Krishna consciousness and go back to material life and just get heavily entangled. So it's a warning also, not just a description. So in Prabhupada's purport to the first verse of this chapter, Srila Prabhupada introduces the chapter, you could say. He says, in the beginning of the 15th chapter, the banyan tree of this material world was explained. The extra roots coming out of it were compared to the activities of the living entities, some auspicious, some inauspicious. In the 9th chapter also, the devas, or godly, and the asuras, the ungodly, or demons, were explained. Now, according to Vedic rites, activities in the mode of goodness are considered auspicious for progress on the path of liberation, and such activities are known as Daivi Prakriti, transcendental by nature. Those who are situated in the transcendental nature make progress on the path of liberation. For those who are acting in the modes of passion and ignorance, on the other hand, there's no possibility of liberation. Either they'll have to remain in this material world as human beings, or they will descend among the species of animals or even lower life forms. In this 16th chapter, the Lord explains both the transcendental nature and its attendant qualities, and the demoniac nature and its qualities. He also explains the advantages and disadvantages of these qualities. Well, that's a pretty good introduction, isn't it? So here in this chapter we have 3 sections. First section is from verse 1 to verse 6. We call it divine and demoniac qualities. And it's listing out some of these things. Divine and demoniac qualities. Then the second section is from verse 7 to verse 20. We'll at least begin that tomorrow. Anyway, we'll see how far we get with it, but at least we'll begin it tomorrow. And it's called the demoniac nature. Oh, Krishna, Krishna. Yeah, that's heavy. It's just super heavy. And then the last section is from verse 21 to 24, and we call that the choice, escaping to the supreme destination. All right. So, without further ado, as so many people say nowadays on, YouTube, and when introducing us, when we're going to speak, without further ado, let's get into the first section. We're going to focus tonight on verses 1 to 6, the divine and demoniac qualities. Let's just see how we do. I imagine we'll finish, and we might even just begin going into the detailed description from verse 7 on, but let's see how we go. All right, so now, verses 1 to 3. In verses 1 to 3, Lord Krishna is listing out some of the main, definitely some of the main divine qualities. Very good qualities. So that's 1 to 3. We'll just read through all the verses now. Here we go, just from 1 to 6. So here's from 1 to 3. The Supreme Personality of Godhead said, fearlessness, purification of one's existence, cultivation of spiritual knowledge, charity, self-control, performance of sacrifice, study of the Vedas, austerity, simplicity, non-violence, truthfulness, freedom from anger, renunciation, tranquility, aversion to fault-finding, compassion for all living entities, freedom from covetousness, gentleness, modesty, steady determination, vigor, forgiveness, fortitude, cleanliness, and freedom from envy and from the passion for honor. These transcendental qualities, O son of Bharat, belong to godly men endowed with divine nature. We go on to verse 4. Okay, so now verse 4 is describing not all by any means, but some of the main not all the main, but some of the main qualities of those who have demoniac natures. Pride, arrogance, conceit, anger, harshness, and ignorance. These qualities belong to those of demoniac nature, O son of Preta. Verse 5. The transcendental qualities are conducive to liberation, whereas the demoniac qualities make for bondage. Do not worry, O son of Pandu, for you are born with the divine qualities. Six, O son of Preta, in this world there are two kinds of created beings. One is called divine, and the other demoniac. I've already explained to you at length the divine qualities. Now hear from me of the demoniac. All right, so that's the first 6 verses. So back to verse 1, or verse 1, 2, and 3. Prabhupada's put them together. The Supreme Personality of Godhead said, fearlessness, purification of one's existence, cultivation of spiritual knowledge, charity, self-control, performance of sacrifice, study of the Vedas, austerity, simplicity, non-violence, truthfulness, freedom from anger, renunciation, tranquility, aversion to fault-finding, compassion for all living entities, freedom from covetousness, gentleness, modesty, steady determination, vigor, forgiveness, fortitude, cleanliness, and freedom from envy and from the passion for honor. These transcendental qualities, O son of Bharata, belong to godly men endowed with divine nature. Well, okay. So, here's an interesting little comment to begin from Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur's purport to these 3 verses. He also puts them together, and he says, remembering that the fruits of the banyan tree of samsara, means birth and death, had not been described in the last chapter. After mentioning them, the Lord in this chapter describes the fruits of the tree, which are of 2 varieties, those which cause liberation and those which cause bondage. First, he describes those giving liberation in 3 verses. Okay, anyway, we see that. Yeah, so the fruits. We can note that Srila Prabhupada did mention right in the first verse of chapter 15, where the the reflected banyan tree is being introduced. Prabhupada in the purport did mention the fruits, although the verses do not directly mention them. And what Prabhupada said was that the fruits are the results of the living entity's activities, namely religion, economic development, sense gratification, and liberation. So, yeah. So the tree, all these things are all connected up together. Yeah, from 13 to 14, from 14 to 15, and now from 15 to 16. These things are all just really connected up together. And even though in many places, or say at least chapters 13 and 14 perhaps particularly, pure devotional service was not obviously emphasized, but definitely the point is pure devotional service. Yeah. So 16 rather, this chapter is going to bring these things out further from how they were brought out, as we saw towards the end of the last chapter, the 15th chapter. Right, so there are 26 qualities here. Godly qualities, they're very nice qualities. Although this is the only mention in the whole chapter, really, of such things. The rest is pretty much just describing the demons. Oh. Anyway, let's go through these qualities, make a few comments on the different qualities as we go. And, you know, let me just say, one interesting little point that is mentioned at the beginning of the second paragraph. Yeah, in the second paragraph, Srila Prabhupada makes reference to how having a good birth helps as far as these qualities are concerned. It helps. You know, of course, Lord Chaitanya, Srila Prabhupada, they're famous for not stressing birth, rather not just, but mainly by far, stressing education, cultivation, chanting, and how anyone from even the worst background can become perfect through following the process by the mercy of pure devotees. But still, it's a fact that a good birth helps. Yeah, of course, a good birth can also carry some challenges, like you may become proud of your good birth, and therefore when the devotees come and they're not emphasizing good birth, and even some of them may obviously be from bad births, if you're in a mood of pride due to having had a good birth, that can become a major obstacle, a big obstacle. But anyway, you see there in the second paragraph that good birth is being described, and it's definitely advantageous. Prabhupada says, the word abhijatasya in reference to one born of transcendental qualities or godly tendencies is very significant. To beget a child in a godly atmosphere is known in the Vedic scriptures as garbhadan samskar. If the parents want a child in the godly qualities, they should follow the 10 principles recommended for the social life of the human being. In Bhagavad Gita we have studied also before that sex life for begetting a good child is Krishna himself. Sex life is not condemned, provided the process is used in Krishna consciousness. Those who are in Krishna consciousness, at least, should not beget children like cats and dogs, but should beget them so that they may become Krishna conscious after birth. That should be the advantage of children born of a father and mother absorbed in Krishna consciousness, hopefully, as much as possible. Right. Okay. Now, in the next paragraph, we have not yet got into the descriptions, the elaborations on the qualities. We're introducing them still. And Prabhupada here now in the third paragraph talks about Varnashram, that Varnashram is meant to divide society not in terms of birth, although there was at least some mention of birth, just we mentioned a minute or two ago, but the divisions, Prabhupada says, are in terms of educational qualifications. They're transcendental qualities. These qualities which we're going to be going through now, they're transcendental qualities meant for helping a person progress in spiritual understanding so, they can get liberation or ultimately go back to Godhead, actually. Oops. Sorry. Okay, all right. So let's now, with those words of introduction, let us start going through the qualities. One point, Prabhupada just mentioned Varnashram and what the idea is. It's not just for designating people according to birth, but facilitating the development of educational qualifications, which also doesn't just mean A, B, C, D, 1, 2, 3, 4 qualifications, but it includes qualifications in terms of personal qualities, character. Yeah. Right, so we go on to now the fourth paragraph. Here we are, the fourth paragraph. And here Srila Prabhupada, in the context of Varnashram, Prabhupada starts talking about the sannyasis, who are in the renounced order of life. That's the top of the whole Varnashram institution, because the sannyasis are also the spiritual masters of the Brahmins. The sannyasis, sannyas ashram is the top ashram, but amongst the Varnas, of course, the Brahmins are the top Varna, but the sannyasis are the spiritual masters of the Brahmins. So sannyasis have quite a unique position then. So then, in getting into these qualities, Srila Prabhupada, it's sort of more or less in the middle, not quite, but getting to the middle of this fourth paragraph, Prabhupada says for a sannyasi, the first qualification should be fearlessness, because a sannyasi has to move about alone with no support, no guarantee of support, just depend on the mercy of the Lord. And Prabhupada gives a warning. If one thinks, after I leave my connections, means family connections and related connections, including work connections and social connections and all that. If one thinks, after I leave my connections, who will protect me? He should not accept the renounced order of life. One should be fully convinced that Krishna, as the super soul, he will take care. He will take care. And even it's not just the sannyasis, it's particularly the sannyasis. But all the devotees, everyone who's really seriously trying to practice Krishna consciousness, they should have a conviction in their hearts that ultimately my shelter materially, I'm talking about materially, how are we going to eat? How will shelter come? That everyone should have this conviction that it's Krishna ultimately who will protect and help me. You know, just like this infamous virus, totally insane virus, who would have dreamt? Almost nobody I know at all. You know, I used to travel, as I think many of you are aware. I used to travel too much. It was just simply too much. Just simply too much. And try to depend on Krishna in that way. Yeah. But then something so unexpected happened. And I've been stuck in the temple since early to mid-February. But I know that many of you also, you got caught. And you were stuck at home. And unable to earn. And how, you know, these questions arise. How will, particularly if you've got a family, how will we keep everyone going? Yeah. So, to depend on Krishna, and this is how to achieve fearlessness. Yeah. So in terms of varnashram, this quality, fearlessness, is first and foremost relevant to the sannyasis, although it has relationships with other categories of other ashrams, you could say. So then, now the first three qualities, fearlessness, purification of one's existence, cultivation of knowledge, in terms of varnashram at least, they are most particularly for the sannyasis. Actually, they're for everyone. But they're like total necessities, and you could say the very foundation for the life of a sannyasi. Yeah. Okay, so then, next paragraph, I think it is. Yes. Then he has to purify his existence, particularly the sannyasis. So Prabhupada emphasizes sannyasis must not have any intimate relationship with a woman. We are not opposed to women. We are not opposed to women. But for sannyasis particularly, intimate relationship, that's out the window, gone. For householders, it's another thing. Although, of course, in the context of Krishna consciousness, as we read, Srila Prabhupada said, the householders should not beget children like cats and dogs, just through gratification of the senses. So, and Prabhupada mentions that for a sannyasi cannot, Prabhupada says, he's even forbidden to talk with a woman in a secluded place. That's what we as sannyasis do. We maintain that standard. We can counsel ladies, that's not a problem, but someone else must be there. Must be there, otherwise not. And Srila Prabhupada explores the subject at quite some length. You know, the whole paragraph, and it's a big paragraph, is all about these things. that with Lord Chaitanya, the female devotees couldn't even come anywhere near at all. They were advised to bow down from a distant place. And Prabhupada says, this was not a sign of hatred for women, but it's a stricture, it's a standard imposed on the sannyasis. And Prabhupada gives, well, he's giving the example of Lord Chaitanya. He was so extremely strict. He rejected Chota Haridas, if you know that story, from Chaitanya Charitamrita, who had begged some rice from the sister of Sikhi Mahiti, sister, right? Yeah, sister, who was an elderly woman. She was not, he was a young man, she was an elderly woman. And he went around begging rice, begging foodstuffs for Lord Chaitanya. And so he begged from her. She's a devotee. In fact, she was a very prominent devotee, actually. And so he's dealing with her, asking for some rice. And somehow or other, some improper desires somehow entered his mind. Not that he expressed them or anything like that at all, but they entered his mind. Lord Chaitanya knew of it. He rejected him. Okay, anyway, then next paragraph, again, as we said, it's more for the sannyasis. Jnana Yoga Vyavastiti, being engaged in the cultivation of knowledge. Sannyasis are meant to preach. Door to door, city to city, country to country. Shoo! Jet age sannyasis. And yes, cultivate knowledge. And then in that regard, Prabhupada mentions humility. In order to cultivate knowledge, well, not exactly cultivate knowledge, but in order to go door to door and preach, give knowledge, a devotee has to be humble. So, yeah, has to be humble, because when you go preaching, you sometimes meet opposing elements. So Prabhupada sums up there, a sannyasi or one in the renounced order of life must be situated in fearlessness, purity and knowledge. So then he goes on, next three are for householders: charity, self-control, performance of sacrifice. And Prabhupada mentions householders should earn honorably and give 50% for spreading Krishna consciousness. And just for Krishna consciousness, not for anything else. Our interpretation of that, by the way, for our current day householders, I mean, it's under discussion, I must admit, but as things stand at the moment, our interpretation of this, what Prabhupada says here, 50% of the income for Krishna consciousness, our interpretation is that after one has taken out whatever is required for, a moderate level of maintenance for you or for you and your family like that, then whatever is left over, 50% of that should be used in Krishna consciousness. And it should be given to the right persons. Prabhupada talks about that. And then next is self-control. And of course it applies to all the orders of life, but particularly for the householders in terms of sex life. And Prabhupada talks about that. And we've already mentioned that to some degree. So then, if, like sex life, Prabhupada says, with contraceptive methods, Prabhupada says, this is not in the transcendental quality, but is demoniac. So everyone, even householders, have to control sex life and only beget children for the purpose of Krishna consciousness. And then next paragraph is sacrifice. It's also particularly for the householders. They should support the brahmacharis, vanaprasthas, and sannyasis, the householders. So they should sacrifice for that. And they should sacrifice, the best sacrifice is the Sankirtan Yajna. Then next paragraph. Next is Swadhyaya, Vedic study. That's meant for the brahmacharis. Brahmacharis should also have no connection with women, live a life of celibacy, and cultivate spiritual knowledge. Then tapas, austerity, for the retired life. Oh, that's interesting. The vanaprasthas, who've lived in household life generally quite comfortably and, having to deal with different challenges, but, a house is there, furniture, motor car, all these things usually are there. So now they retire and take vanaprastha and then live a very simple life. And even also travel around and preach. So, then next paragraph, next is simplicity. Everyone should be very simple and straightforward. Duplicity is a very materialistic quality usually. Next is ahimsa, not arresting the progressive life of any living entity. In other words, not killing unless absolutely necessary. And Prabhupada talks about how people nowadays are addicted to eating animals, even though there's plenty of grains and veggies and fruits, is just so much. But they have a taste for blood. As His Holiness Krishnadas Swami would say, they like sucking blood. So real ahimsa means not to check anyone's progressive life. And real elsewhere, I must admit it's elsewhere, Prabhupada talks about ahimsa as being preaching. Real non-violence means to preach Krishna consciousness. So satyam is next, truth, to be truthful. Akrodha means to check anger. And tejas is for the Kshatriyas. Yeah, tejas is for the Kshatriyas. Shocham means cleanliness, which is, Prabhupada says, not only in mind and body, but in one's dealings also. We shouldn't, for Vaishyas, mercantile people, they shouldn't engage in the black market. Then, where are we now? What have I done? Okay. Well, there you go. Those are the qualities. Those are the discussions of the qualities from Prabhupada. Let's now go on to, because we've got to finish this section tonight. Prabhupada says at the end of the purport, right at the end of the purport for these 3 verses, all these 26 qualifications mentioned are transcendental qualities. They should be cultivated according to the different statuses of social and occupational order. As we mentioned, different varnas, different ashrams, these different qualities were particularly related to. The purport is that even though material conditions are miserable, if these qualities are developed by practice by all classes of men, then gradually it's possible to rise to the highest platform of transcendental realization. Right. And Prabhupada makes a comment in one lecture on this verse. So those godly characteristics are there. Either you practice yourself to come to the godly characteristics, or there is simply method. If you take to devotional service, all the good godly qualities automatically come. This is the process. So in this age, to develop these godly qualities is very difficult. But if you take to Krishna consciousness by the simple method, by chanting Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, then automatically you develop all the godly qualities. All right? Verse 4, pride, arrogance, conceit, anger, harshness, and ignorance. These qualities belong to those of demoniac natures. Do you mind, Mataji, could you just close the door? It's a bit too noisy for the sound system. If you don't mind, thanks very much. Right, so in the purport, Srila Prabhupada begins, in this verse, the royal road to hell is described. Ah, yes, that's a fact. So let's just have a very brief look at these bad qualities, 6 of them. So, pride, false pretense. They want to make a show of religion, to be known as religious, although they don't follow the principles. Then arrogance. Well, pride, arrogance, and conceit are very closely connected, actually. They're very closely related, although there are subtle differences. Yeah. Anyway, false pride, arrogance. Arrogance is sort of a specialized form of pride where you really advertise yourself for whatever good you think you are. And conceit, well, Prabhupada, the way Prabhupada puts it, is the person wants to be worshipped, demands respectability, but can't command it. Anyway, these things are very closely related. Anger, becoming angry over trifles. Harshness, speaking harshly, not able to be gentle. Cruelty. And now it's the frogs taking off. The birds were so loud. Anyway. Right. So your harshness, speaking harshly, unable to be gentle, and being cruel. Ignorance, doesn't know what to do, what not to do, therefore acts whimsically and doesn't recognize authority. And Prabhupada concludes the purport by saying, these demoniac qualities are taken on by them from the beginning of their bodies in the wombs of their mothers. And as they grow, they manifest all these inauspicious qualities. So again, right, there's a mention of birth. Not that birth has just never got anything to do with anything. But if one is born in a demoniac family, then of course one will take the qualities of the parents, and then of course one will live with the demoniac parents, and that will encourage the demoniac qualities. So just as having a good birth, it's good, or it can be good, can easily be good, although it's not guaranteed that it must be good. So to be born in a really demoniac family in many cases means you follow in their footsteps, but not always. Okay, then verse 5. The transcendental qualities are conducive to liberation, whereas the demoniac qualities make for bondage. Do not worry, O son of Pandu, for you are born with the divine qualities. So, Prabhupada talks about how Arjuna may be in anxiety that, here I am on the battlefield, I'm meant to kill relatives, seniors, all you devotees, you know that story. So you may think this is demoniac. But actually, it's not demoniac. It's not demoniac because he was acting, ultimately because he was acting under the direction of Krishna. According to one of our acharyas, Krishna tells him, your arrows are your religion. Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur says, to comfort Arjuna, who was thus worried, the Lord speaks, do not worry, you are born with the divine qualities. O Pandava, for one born in a Kshatriya family, anger and cruelty during war are prescribed by the scriptures. To do otherwise would mean you have an asuric nature. Yeah. To not act as a Kshatriya in a war situation would mean you're accepting demoniac qualities. So Prabhupada concludes the purport by saying, for a Kshatriya, a military man, shooting arrows at the enemy is considered transcendental, and refraining from such a duty is demoniac. Therefore there was no cause for Arjuna to lament. Anyone who performs the regulative principles of the different orders of life is transcendentally situated. So in one lecture on this verse, 5 of chapter 16, Prabhupada gives the example of Arjuna fighting, the gopis going to Krishna, and Prahlad watching while his father was killed. Normally, these would all be considered sinful, but because they're engaged in Krishna consciousness, they're considered divine. And verse 6, O son of Pritha, in this world there are two kinds of created beings. One is called divine and the other demoniac. I've already explained to you at length the divine qualities. Now hear from me of the demoniac. Wow. Tune in tomorrow. Yeah. So basically, Prabhupada makes the point in the purport that basically the conditioned souls are divided into two classes. They're either divine or demoniac. Divine, Prabhupada defines here, it's an interesting definition. Those with divine qualities follow a regulated life, which means they abide by the injunctions of scripture and the authorities. So one should do like that. This is divine. And one who doesn't follow those regulative principles and who acts according to his whims is called demoniac. There is no criterion